Are the slides changing? Okay, cool. So good afternoon, let us start. So until last class, we discussed the brain maps, and before that we discussed the organization of the nervous system. And in the organization of the nervous system, we talked a little bit about sensory motor systems and all that, and the functions of the subcortical structures in a very superficially. So for want of time, I will skip a topic and move on to emotions, because emotions are more difficult to understand and more fascinating. Even neuroscience is a mysterious subject, and a lot of work is going on. We don't have a final theory of emotions or anything like that. But generally, to understand emotions, you have to approach it from many different directions, from through many different fields. So it's a very fascinating subject, and so let us try to understand emotions from the point of view of psychology, for neuroscience, and so on. It's fascinating because in case of vision, if you want to understand how does brain process vision, you can have simplistic explanations like, for example, when I present a picture of a face, you have neurons in infratemporal cortex which respond specifically to that picture. So you can say that that's how the brain processes images. So there's some simple explanation. But when it comes to emotions, you cannot say that when emotions are encoded in this part of the brain, and if you are happy, these neurons are active. If you are sad, these neurons are active. It's not that simple. It's much more subtle with many parts of the brain working together. And we still don't have a good satisfactory and comprehensive theory of emotions. There are lots of bits and pieces, like typically the situation is with most branches of neuroscience. But since it's fascinating, I thought let us spend some time on that. So you can approach emotion, the question of emotion, from many different fields, right? You can approach it from philosophy point of view, because that's one of the oldest branches of human life that people study. So in philosophy, in arts, in literature, people study emotions, right? Because your book or your novel will be likely to be lot more insightful or impactful if you can bring out human emotion in it, right? So you need to be a good kind of scholar of emotions if you want to write a good book. Similar psychology, again, a lot of inputs come from psychology, and by looking at a person's behavior, again, you can understand emotion to some extent. And finally, where we come from in this course is neuroscience, that means from neurophysiology. By looking at actual brain and actual changes in the body in various physiological systems, right? What can you say about emotions? So let us look at that a little bit in small steps. Let us start with the first one from philosophy. So, in this process, let us start from Indian philosophy and let's see what Indian philosophy has to say about emotions. So, let us start with Bhagavad Gita. So, in Gita talks about uh, 6 inner enemies, what is called Arishad Vargas. That is, we are supposed to have 6 emotions, which are actually considered to be enemies, which are bad for us. Like these are desire is considered bad, right? Anger, greed, delusion, pride, and jealousy. The Sanskrit words for these are kama, krodha, lobha, moha, mada, and matsarya. So the Gita points out that there are these 6 inner enemies, these bad emotions, and watch out for them, and then try to get rid of them or transcend them and get into a state of total equanimity, and you are not moved by anything. You don't have all these tumultuous emotions that normal people experience all the time due to stimuli coming from life, etc., etc. That's what Gita says. Then if you look at Patanjali Yoga Sutras, another ancient text, it talks about raga and dvesha, and it says these are the 2 major emotions of the mind, right? And what are called, they're called klesha. They are afflictions. They're bad things. They're like diseases of the mind. Both love, that is raga or attachment, and dvesha or hate are bad, and therefore get rid of them. So very often you see that if you look at Indian yoga literature or philosophical literature, it deals with emotions in slightly negative terms. By and large, they are bad, and try to overcome them, try to grapple with them, kind of conquer them, overcome them. They are in general bad for you, especially if you are interested in yoga sadhana and things like that. Whereas, for a common man, who is not a yogi or anything, emotions are a part of life. You need emotions. So therefore, if you leave alone Indian philosophical literature and look at more like artistic literature, right? Emotions are dealt with slightly differently. For example, in Indian aesthetics, or for example, Natya Shastra, written by Bharata. Natya Shastra is about expressing human life and human life situations and human characters, and therefore their emotions and feelings and so on. So obviously, in Natya Shastra, you cannot say all emotions are bad and get rid of them, ban them, right? That won't work. So you need to give them a place and express them, deal with them perfectly, understand them, and so on. So Natya talks about 8 primary rasas. So this rasa has nothing to do with the rasam or sambar or anything. Rasa literally means essence, right? Or more like a more physical, material meaning is juice, but also means essence. So it talks about 8 rasas, and these are Shringaram or love, especially like a man-woman kind of love, and humor or mirth, hasyam, then fury or raudram, compassion, karunyam, disgust or bibhatsam, horror, bhayanakam, valor, veeram, and wonder, adbhutam. So they kind of identified that these are the 8 major emotions that humans feel, and therefore in art, in dance, we are supposed to express them with great precision and perfection. Then few more emotions have been added to this list. I'm just using the word emotions because it's convenient. Otherwise, we'll start splitting hair about what is the correct term for emotions and things like that. So 8th century, apparently, another emotion called Shantam was added to the whole list, right? And 2 more added later, Vatsalyam. That is especially kind of a kindness or a kind of empathy that that a senior person feels towards a junior person, especially a teacher feels towards a student, right? And then bhakti, which is love but love of God. So you can see that over a period of time, people kept on adding emotions to this list of original emotions. So you'll see this kind of a trend in Western culture also. So you'll see that there is no kind of a sacred or standard list of emotions. It varies from culture to culture, from writer to writer, to thinker, and the list is slightly adjustable and variable. So this is a picture that tells you how emotions are portrayed in Indian classical dance. I think it is Odissi, but I'm not very sure. And, somebody told me it's not Bharatanatyam, but if somebody knows in this class, please correct me. So all the 9 rasas are shown here: love, wonder, fury, disgust, and so on and so forth. The Indian theory of rasas goes even further, right? And instead of just giving names to various rasas or these emotions, they also associate a certain deity or a god to various emotions. In India, we have to link everything to gods, right? And that's kind of very deep in our culture. So here also, people try to link various emotions to various gods. And not only that, interestingly, they also associate with various colors. And this association with emotion and between emotion and color is something that you will see in Western tradition also. We'll see that very soon in this class. So Sringaram, the god is Vishnu, and the color is light green. Hasyam, the god is I don't know who this god is, Pramata, and the color is white. And Raudram, the god is Rudra, apparently one of the kind of facets of Shiva, right? And then color is red. And Karunyam is compassion. The god is Yama. I don't know how exactly, but the color is gray. Bibhatsam is disgust, and god again is Shiva. The color is blue, and so on and so forth. Okay, so each emotion or a rasa has a certain deciding deity and also certain color. If you look at Western tradition, here also philosophers have speculated on emotion, the nature of emotion, the list of emotions. What are all the emotions that a human being can experience? So Aristotle, who was a great thinker and writer, he wrote extensively on wide variety of subjects of human life, not just philosophy. He also wrote extensively on science, on many topics of science. Unfortunately, most of the Greek writings on science in those days, in that period, this are based on observation and straightaway speculation. They're not based on experimentation. Experimentation came much later, Galileo and the experimental method and all that. So therefore, there are a lot of flaws in his explanations of physical phenomena, but that's a different matter. So Aristotle talks of emotions. The list he gives is like this: anger, mildness. You don't know what that means. Just being a temperate, uh, passive person. love and enmity, which is opposite of love, is similar to raga and dvesha. Then fear, confidence, shame, and opposite of shame, shamelessness. Then benevolence, pity, indignation, envy, and emulation and contempt. So, okay, so he has given some list, and there's no sanctity to this. So you see that the list keeps varying. Then much more recently, so Aristotle is BC, I don't know, something like 2nd century BC or something like that. Now, much more recently in 17th century, Dutch philosopher Spinoza talks of the link between emotions and cognition, which is a very important actually observation because that connection became clear only much later with our improved understanding of physiology, right? And so I'll come back to those theories very soon. So again, he didn't give any list of emotions, but also if you look at the previous list also, there's no universal or a standard list of emotions. Each author or each thinker, based on that person's experience and insight, they gave a list of emotions which kept varying from person to person. Now, a more kind of a standard, scientifically oriented approach to emotion came with the understanding that emotion can be expressed in facial expression. Now, emotion is an abstract thing. Facial expression is not an abstract thing. You can see it and you can process it. You can quantify it. For example, you are raising your brows, like this baby here is, doing so cutely. You can, fit some curves to those eyebrows and then extract some parameters, some features, and say, okay, if the brow is raised to by 5 millimeters, the baby is very upset and whatever. You can make up some silly theory like that. Okay, so emotions are abstract, but facial expressions can be quantified. So that's the beginning of an objective theory of emotions. So one of the first persons who talked about the connection between facial expression and emotion was none other than Charles Darwin, the evolutionary biologist. And here he noticed and made a very interesting observation. He noted that the emotions there are lots of universal emotions, but more interestingly, the facial expressions are also universal. You find certain standard facial expressions, not only in various cultures across the planet, but also in various animal species. Right? You can see shared facial expressions between both animals and humans. So that's kind of a beginning of a much broader theory of emotion. Because now, the moment we talk about facial expression, that's something you can observe, and then it becomes an objective thing. So this is what Darwin says about this. The movements of expression in the face and body, whatever their origin may have been, are in themselves of much importance for our welfare. They serve as the first means of communication between the mother and her infant, because it is through expression of face that you communicate. That's the first means of communication, right? Even if you're not saying anything, your face and your body language speaks so much. So, for example, if you look at the communication between mother and infant, right? She smiles her approval. The baby does something wrong, something right. Mother smiles, and baby understands that she did a good thing, and thus encourages her child on the right path, or frowns disapproval. Right? And we readily perceive sympathy in others by their expression. The moments of expression give vividness and energy to our spoken words. Right? You could be saying very kind words, but if your face doesn't reflect it, and if your face is all kind of curled up and the body is stiff, then your kind words don't ring true. They seem to be somewhat shallow. So there can be a mismatch between what you say and your facial expression. Facial expression is more powerful. It really expresses a lot more than your words. So they reveal the thoughts and intentions of others more truly than do words, which may be falsified. So, like I was saying, there is Darwin observed a lot of commonality between facial expressions of animals and humans. I mean, here is a simple example, right? The gesture of snarling in a human and in an animal. And interestingly, I've noticed that South Indian actors are very good at this expression. You'll see, very typical this kind of expression in South Indian heroes. Anyway, so Darwin just made some observations about the link between facial expression and emotion, but subsequently others have done a more formal classification of these expressions, and again have come up with a list of emotions. So, for example, Sylvan Tompkins has studied emotion, and then he coined the term affect. So, note that this is different from affect. Affect is defined as a biological portion of emotion. Because I think when you talk about emotion, especially if you want to study the neuroscience of emotion, right, then you need to have a different word for what is the physical aspect of emotion as is reflected in the brain and nervous system, and what is the psychological aspect of emotion. So you need to have different terms for it. So the term that people use in neuroscience to look at the substrates of emotion in the nervous system, that is affect. So the field in neuroscience that talks about emotion is called affective neuroscience. Okay, that's the biological aspect of neuroscience, all the hormones and the autonomic nervous system and all this support network for emotions in the nervous system. The study of that is called the affective nervous system. So this refers to the hardwired, pre-programmed, genetically transmitted mechanisms that exist in each of us, which when triggered precipitate a known pattern of biological events. And the expression of these events is what we normally call emotion. Okay, so he was focusing on that. And based on such an analysis and classification of facial expressions, he has come up with again list of emotions. These are like surprise, joy, interest, fear, rage, disgust, shame, and anguish. You see that if you go back to the list of emotions by Aristotle or more modern list like this, there are a lot of common emotions because emotions are universal. There are at least a lot of them. There are also some give and take, some plus or minus in this list. Similarly, Paul Ekman, who has also used facial expressions to study emotions, came with a slightly different list: surprise, happiness, anger, fear, disgust, and sadness. Both lists don't perfectly match, but there's a lot of common entries in the two lists. Another thing is these are just given like lists, right? There is no attempt to relate one with the other. Like for example, mm, happiness and happiness, okay, is a more positive emotion. Anger, fear, disgust, sadness are all negative emotions. Surprise is kind of on the happier side, positive side, but not as positive as happiness. Now, so similarly, so like earlier we talked about in love and hate, right? They're opposite. So there are interrelationships among emotions. So giving just a list of emotions is no good. We need to have some kind of a map of emotions, which tries to show relationships among various emotions. So the first attempt of that kind was done by Robert Plutchik, where he used colors to indicate emotions and represent emotions, and that way he was also able to portray the relationships among emotions. Okay, so for example, in this color chart, the color wheel of Plutchik, you have uh, see joy and acceptance at the top, which are positive, and for every emotion there is it's a sector, occupies sector in the wheel, and its opposite emotion is the diametrically opposite sector. So acceptance and disgust are opposite. So joy and sadness are opposite. Fear and anger are opposite, and surprise and anticipation are obviously opposite. Now, so like that we have four emotions and therefore opposites. Now, if you look at the circumference, the words written outside the circle, they represent composite emotions. For example, joy plus acceptance is like love. Okay, and acceptance and fear. You accept something, but out of fear, that is submission. So you have no other option. You are afraid something will happen if you rebel. So you accept, and that is called submission. And fear and surprise is awe. You are surprised about it, but also you are not sure. You are slightly shaky about what might be the consequence. Therefore, you are awed by it. Okay, then surprise and sadness. You are surprised by what has happened because it's different from what you expected. But it's ultimately a negative outcome. So you are sad, and that is disappointment. So like that, this guy has done a kind of an analysis of different emotions and connected them and put them in some kind of a framework. Right? Color is just a way of representing them, representing the idea. So colors also have some kind of relationships. There are opposite colors, there are similar colors, and so on. So these ideas are used and somehow used to express the relationships among emotions. And these ideas are taken further, and people have drawn much more complex wheel pictures of emotions. So, for example, in this depiction, so you see again, opposite sectors have opposite meaning or opposite emotions. So, for example, if you look at the innermost wheel or circle, at the upper end you have ecstasy, and the bottom end you have grief, which are obviously opposites: extreme happiness and extreme sadness, that is grief. And if you go further outwards from ecstasy, you have joy, which is slightly milder form of ecstasy. And if you go even further, you have serenity, which is even more a milder form of joy. Okay, so this on the positive axis, as you come close to the center, it's more and more intense, a high value. And as you go away from center, it is less and less intense and more weak or more neutral. Right, similarly, if you go away from grief, you have sadness and then pensiveness. You are just kind of moody and you're in a kind of a not a very happy state of mind. You're not exactly sad, but just pensive, thoughtful. Okay, just slightly anxious. So like that, you can show some shades of emotion. So in the previous wheel, it is opposite pairs of emotion and combinations. Here it's shades of emotion based on intensity of emotion. So you can, like this, people have made attempts to put emotions on a certain framework where their relationships can be shown in terms of the position of that emotion in that framework, and you can express their opposite relationships, right? And then the shades of intensity. So the use of color is the basis of this is right what we already know, but just I want to recall that for you. So we know that there are three primary colors, RGB, right? Red, green, and blue. And if you add all three, you get white, right? And therefore, if you do a simple algebra of colors, you get R plus G is equal to W minus B, and W minus B happens to be yellow. So R plus B is W minus G, which happens to be magenta, and G plus B, which is W minus R, which happens to be cyan. So if you look at this color chart in the middle, the centermost one is where all three colors meet, and therefore you have white there. Now the combination of blue and green gives you cyan, right, which happens to be white minus red. So therefore cyan is opposite of red. So similarly, combination of blue and red gives you magenta, right, which is white minus green. Okay, and combination of green and red gives you yellow, which is white minus blue. Okay, so these relationships among colors we know very well. So these ideas are used to depict colors and the relationships in these color charts of emotion. So like that, people made some initial approaches to emotion, but if you want to go actually into psychology proper, right, and look at what emotions are and how are they generated by the brain and the body, right? And one of the first attempts in that direction goes like this. So until now, the kind of theory of emotions that we have seen is simply based on a classification of facial expression. So people have looked at facial expression and gave some labels in terms of emotion to that, and then classified them and put them in a framework. But that doesn't say anything about how does brain produce emotions or how does a person feel emotions, right? And what is the involvement of body and all this? They don't address any of those questions, right? So you need a more deeper like a psychological theory to explain that. One of the first attempts in that direction was by American psychologist William James in the late 19th century. This man had a slightly different take on the subject, right? He said something just totally counterintuitive, totally opposite to what we normally believe. So he begins with this question: do we run from a bear because we are afraid, or we are afraid because we run? Which comes first? It's like a chicken and egg question. Our normal understanding is that you are afraid of the bear, you see the big bear, and then it's ready to pounce on you, so you get scared and start running. So that's our normal sequence. But what James says is, my thesis is that the bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, and that our feeling of the same changes as they occur is emotion. Okay, what is he saying here? So when there is the exciting fact, that means the stimulus which is producing that emotion. Here in this case, let's say a big bear, right? And the presentation of that bear produces certain changes in your brain and in your mind and all that. It also produces certain changes in your body. Your heart starts pounding. You start sweating, and right, your pupils dilate. A lot of changes occur. This autonomic changes occur in the body. James doesn't talk about all that, but he kind of clearly points out that all these bodily changes that occur in response to that stimulus called the bear. And your experience of all those bodily changes, in addition to whatever is going on high up in your brain, right? This is emotion. This experience is what we call emotion. So basically, he emphasizes the involvement of body, right, in our experience of emotion. So what he's saying is, there's a stimulus, which is the bear, which produces a response, which is running. Running happens in the body, right? It doesn't happen just in the brain. So that now that there is a response in the body, that response, when it is fed back to the brain, right, it is felt as a particular feeling of or emotion, which is the fear in this case. So he was basically emphasizing that emotion is somatic. Emotion is a bodily thing. It's not something that happens like just in your brain. So to expand on that theme, what William James says is, my theory is that the bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, and that our feeling of the same changes as they occur in the emotion. Common sense says we lose our fortune or sorrow and weep. We meet a bear, are frightened and run. We are insulted by a rival, are angry and strike. So he says, common sense, according to common sense, the cause and effect relationships are like this. Something bad happens and we feel bad, we feel sorry and we start crying. Or we see a bear and we are afraid and start running. Right? Or we are somebody insults us and then we are angry and therefore we hit back. So the sequence is there's a stimulus and then there is emotion response to that and then the physical response. That is a normal sequence. Whereas he says that's not like that. The hypothesis here to be defended says that this order of sequence is incorrect. We feel sorry because we cry. The process of crying, the act of crying, is the one that really contributes to your emotion. Okay, so similarly, angry because we strike. So the act of striking, right, is what really contributes to your experience of emotion. Afraid because we tremble. The act of trembling, the physical changes of trembling, are the ones which really contribute to experience of emotion of fear. So without the bodily changes following on the perception, the latter would be purely cognitive in form, pale, colorless, destitute of emotional warmth. So that's the main thing. So emotion is something that is warm and colorful, and it has energy that comes with it. Right? Imagine you sitting quietly in your in your chair and working out some math problem. Right? And imagine that state of mind. Compare that with, right, you are sitting in the edge of the seat and watching a horror movie. So obviously, in the first case, there's no emotion. You're just quietly working out some theorem and proof and all that. Of course, if you successfully solve a problem after a lot of difficulty, you feel very happy. That's emotion again. But you do something very abstract, right? You are in a quiet state of mind. There's not much of emotion going on there. But if you are watching some, like a major action movie or a horror movie, right? That's what you're feeling. All the, right, your heart pounding and all that is emotion. So obviously, these are very different states, bodily states. In case of emotion, there's a lot of contribution coming from the bodily response. That's what is emphasizing. So just to clarify, common sense understanding of emotion is stimulus, then feeling, then the bodily physical response in terms of acting out. Whereas in James' theory, stimulus, there's a response, and the feedback from the body back to the brain. Right, that is what gives you the emotion and the feeling. Now, others also have said similar things. For example, there's Mr. Lange. He said physiological responses contribute emotions. Again, very similar idea. He particularly emphasized the role of vasomotor responses, how the vascular or cardiac responses to emotion, because heart pounding is a very important part of your autonomic response to emotions. So therefore these ideas are a lot of very convergent. So therefore this theory of emotion is called the James-Lange theory of emotion. So what does it say? There's an emotional stimulus, like the bear. It is perceived by the brain, through the senses. It is perceived by the brain. Then brain sends signals to the body. Okay, so this sending signals to the body doesn't happen in situations where there's not much emotion going on. Like I said, in the case where you are sitting and solving some math problems. So that autonomous activation of the body takes place. Brain sends us those signals. Then the body gets activated. There's perspiration and accelerated heart rate and all that takes place. And that is fed back to the brain. And now what happens in the brain, that is felt as emotion. Okay, so this is how the emotion, this is the mechanism of emotion. Then subsequently, Walter Cannon, American physiologist, he developed the idea of homeostasis. Homeostasis was first proposed by Claude Bernard. I think he's also an American, right? Who basically says that there is this mechanisms in the body which try to maintain a lot of physiological parameters at some standard values, like body temperature, and heart rate, and pressure. All this, your brain and the autonomic nervous system tries to maintain them at certain standard values. The deviations from that, then it may or may not be serious, but generally it means even your very definition of health, right, means that certain parameters are close to certain standard values. So that is homeostasis, and so Walter Cannon borrowed the idea from Claude Bernard and developed it further. And he also coined the term flight or fight. So this is just a nice expression that captures our autonomic responses, especially the sympathetic action. There are two branches of autonomic nervous system. So the part of nervous system, which is, so because we talked about peripheral nervous system. So in peripheral, there are again two branches, the somatic and autonomic. In autonomic, there is again, so somatic is one where its action is driven voluntarily. So suppose you raise your hand, right? That's something you are doing voluntarily. So those signals come through the somatic nervous system, which is also a part of the peripheral nervous system. Whereas, if you are watching a horror movie and your heart rate goes up, that's not something you are doing voluntarily. You cannot control it. Because if you are watching a horror movie and you cannot tell your heart to stay quiet and not get excited, right? Unless you are a yogi or something. So those kinds of changes also are driven by peripheral nervous system, but that's not within your control. So these come from the autonomic nervous system. In autonomic nervous system, again, there are two branches: the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. Parasympathetic is more passive. It takes care of your what is called the sympathetic nervous system that acts. And what is interesting about sympathetic nervous system is that whenever it acts, it produces a wide spectrum of changes all over the body, and it is not specific. If it acts, if it gets activated at all, it does all those things. So therefore, this action of SNS is called mass discharge, because whenever it acts, all these things happen in parallel. Like, for example, there's increase in heart rate, there's increased perspiration, there is piloerection, that means your hair rising, that's what you call goosebumps, right? And all these things, the whole other things I'll maybe discuss later. A whole bunch of things take place irrespective of the actual emotion. Okay, so that's something common to various emotions. Then, so the thing is, therefore, these physiological responses that you see in various emotions, they're not specific, right? So that is the Cannon-Barth theory. There's emotional stimulus which is specific, like a bear, for example, right? And then the autonomous activation, the signal goes to the body, and there the same changes occur in the body because the autonomous activation is usually SNS, sympathetic activation. And whenever it happens, the same set of things happen all the time. So the feedback is also non-specific, and that goes to the brain. So this is called Cannon-Barth theory. Now, just to understand this, how weird this theory is and how unsatisfactory this theory is, this is weird in the sense it's a fact. I mean, the fact that the bodily feedback is non-specific is a fact, but that raises a very important question. Then how do you distinguish between different emotions? Because if all those cases the physiological response is the same. Let me give you an example, right? Let us say maybe you've written a kind of a love poem and you want to present it to somebody, some girl, on a Valentine's Day or something. Right? You have mugged up the poem and then and you're all go to this girl and then start reading out this poem in a very articulate fashion and all that. So because there's a lot of emotion involved, it's, I guess, positive emotion, and you'll have all the physiological changes, like your heart rate, heart starts pounding, and you start sweating, right, and so on and so forth. Okay, so take that as one situation. So there's one emotion, the romantic emotion, and then you have all these changes. Take a very different situation. You're watching a horror movie, right, and suddenly, somebody goes to a kitchen and opens the fridge, and suddenly they see a big, I don't know, huge, a head of a dead body or something like that. And that guy starts screaming. Some rubbish like that. So there also again, when you see that, suddenly, you see your heart starts pounding, you start sweating, and so on and so forth. So obviously, it's absurd, right? The first situation, which is quite positive and nice, second situation, which is more negative. In both cases, the responses occurring in your autonomic nervous system are very similar, which is absurd. How do you distinguish one from the other? Okay, so this is a major problem that was posed by the previous theories, right? The non-specificity of the physiological arousal, the feedback coming from the body, right, which contributes to the emotion obviously and gives it all the color and warmth that William James was talking about. It is non-specific. So how do you get specificity? So in answer to that very important question, these two guys, Schachter and Singer, they kind of plug that missing hole, right, missing that gap, and said that it is a cognitive aspect that gives specificity. So what does it mean? The physiological response is same in all sorts of emotions, but at the cognitive level, right? If you are proposing to a girl and all that, you see positive emotion. The bodily feedback is the same. But if you are seeing a ghost, then you feel negative emotion. You feel negative emotion. But bodily feedback is the same. So your cognition, what is happening at the level of your brain and your cognition, it is that produces a difference in your emotional experience. This is the kind of explanation given. So to test that, they did some interesting experiments. So in this experiment, the subjects were given an injection of adrenaline. So adrenaline activates your SNS, because that's why people say that if you are riding a roller coaster or you're doing bungee jumping or something, right? Something very adventurous and exciting. You have this so-called adrenaline rush. Even when you're going on your two-wheeler and at a very high speed on a road recklessly, you have this adrenaline rush because it activates your SNS. So people are given injection of adrenaline, and in one room, subjects were exposed to a pleasant. So that they divide into three groups. In the first group, they were exposed to some pleasant, stimuli. So actually, what happened was they hired some actors, and in the first room, the actors did something funny and interesting and nice. In the second room, the actors did something nasty or something scary or something. In the third room, they did something neutral. Okay. So the feelings that the subjects reported in the three rooms, right, corresponded to the situation. So the subjects were exposed to a positive stimuli in the actor, doing something funny. They said it's very nice and it was funny and they were happy about it. In the second room, they were upset or whatever. The third room, there was neutral. So point is, here it's a very interesting situation. You need the bodily feedback to give that energy to the emotion, but the identity of emotion doesn't come from that bodily feedback. It comes from your cognitive, right? Your cognitive aspect. So this is how they were able to resolve this kind of a conflicting situation between the involvement of body and physiological systems and the aspect of cognition. Okay, so yeah, so thing is, okay, so that's an interesting observation, but how exactly do people combine this cognitive, this cognitive aspect along with the bodily feedback and come up with the precise emotion, the specific emotion? So that has led to this theory of cognitive evaluations. One of those theories of that kind was proposed by Magda Arnold. It's called the appraisal theory. Okay, what does it say? It says that emotional feeling depends on cognitive appraisal. The cognition just says, okay, so there is a girl in front of me, or there's a bear, there is something else. Okay, so that's just cognition. Your perception says what you are looking at. This is all high level activity in the brain. That's cognition. Now there's an appraisal that you do in the back end based on that cognition. What is appraisal? What does it do? It answers this question: is it good for me or is it bad? Is it a good thing or a bad? This kind of a judgment that you apply to your perceptions, right? That happens in the back end. In fact, happens unconsciously, right? And it is this that creates emotion, and it is this that creates specificity in emotions. It adds specificity to emotions. Okay, let me elaborate on it. It's a very important idea. So you have the stimulus, which is a presentation of something, and then you have an appraisal, which happens unconsciously. And then you try to do something about it, you try to respond. You may or may not actually respond, but you want to feel like responding. And that feeling, it is that creates an emotion. Okay, so let me give you an example. Just give me a minute. So let us just visualize a situation where I'm sure some of you have attended interviews, some kind of interviews at some point or other. So imagine you are sitting facing an interview panel, and it's very important. This job is very important to you. And somebody asks some question. Initially, you're not sure how things go. You think it's 50-50. Then first couple of questions were bouncers, and you feel bad. You feel you get that sinking feeling and all that. So then you think it's all gone. Then suddenly somebody asks you some easy question. That's your pet question, and you give a perfect answer. Everybody is very happy. Suddenly your mood lifts up, and you think you're going to get the job. And a couple of other questions are also nice, and your hopes build up. And suddenly some fellow sitting at the end of the table asks a very difficult question, really nasty question. There's no way you can answer that. So you wanted to study that, but last minute you forgot studying that. You feel really bad. You start hating yourself, and then your hopes again start nosediving, right? So you are going through this roller coaster ride. The stimuli is the same, right? Stimuli is whatever it is, but your appraisal of it, right, in terms of positive and negative, is constantly going on. So there's a graph which is going up and down. So it is this appraisal. We do this kind of appraisal about everything that's happening around us. Our whole life situation that we face every day, right? There is a simple cognitive aspect, right? I mean, there is a bus, there is a tree, there is a road, whatever. This is simple cognition. But then what does it mean for me? Is it good for me or bad for me? That is appraisal. That is happening all the time, unconsciously. It is this that links your perceptions and your cognitions to your emotions. So this Richard Lazarus has taken this theory of emotion based on appraisal and proposed theory of coping. Thing is, when people make this appraisal, so your cognitions are more or less fixed and standard. Because if I show you a color blue, everybody will say it's color blue. I mean, there's not much of conflict or argument about it. Although there also you can create some situations very cleverly, and where people will start fighting about what is the color exactly that they're looking at, and that's quite possible. But by and large, if you look at simple sensory perceptions, very often there's not much of controversy. People agree. But when it comes to appraisal, which happens unconsciously, and a lot of interesting consequences of that, we'll see that later, right? And that can change a lot from person to person. So in fact, even something like a very simple stimulus, like suppose you miss a bus, right? And you can take it as that's you think. I think so one person can think it's the end of the world, and you're going to be late to the work today, and your boss is going to be upset with you, and you're going to fire you, and then you'll be on the streets, and you'll be homeless. So you can have a whole line of negative thoughts, all because you missed a bus. On the other hand, you can take it completely casually. Okay, if this bus, if I miss this bus, I get the next bus, and nothing is going to happen. I'll manage, and so on and so forth. So the thing is, appraisal is something very subjective and individual dependent. Cognitions are more or less same for everybody, and that's why there's a lot of variability from person to person. Now, so the ability to make positive appraisals and manage life situations, that is called coping, right? So the theory of appraisal leads to theory of coping, because that tells you how right? And how you are able to take life situations and how you are able to appraise them in such a way that you don't feel overwhelmed by life situations. Okay, so there's a lot of work that is done on those lines. So here also now, earlier people were classifying emotions, but now we classify appraisals. Okay, so which are very similar to emotions. Again, anger here means a demeaning offense against me and mine. Fear means facing an immediate, concrete, and overwhelming physical danger. Sadness means having experienced an irrevocable loss. Disgust means taking in or being too close to an indigestible object or an idea. Okay, and happiness means making visible progress towards the realization of a goal. So all these things, appraisal means whatever has happened to you or is going to happen to you, right? Is it good or bad? Right? This is what is appraisal. Emotion is created because of this. So what we have now, a new element is an emotional stimulus, which is done, which you process consciously, whether a bear or a ghost or whatever, and then that goes into your unconscious parts of your mind as an appraisal. Because it's unconscious, you don't have much control over it. That's why there's so much of variability and from person to person. Why? That's why it's because it's difficult to control. It becomes a problem. Right? If your appraisals are positive and reasonable, then it's not a problem. But every appraisals are very unrealistic and extreme. That can put you in very grave situations, and that's when you say that people are not able to cope up with their life situations. All that comes because of these unconscious processes of appraisal. Now, okay, so that's how the theories of appraisal have progressed, right? Now, if you look at what happened in the 20th century, especially the mainstream thinking about brain and mind, there are two. You can divide the whole century into two halves. In the first half, there was this behaviorist revolution because what happened is up to late 19th century, for example, William James, and all these guys worked in the late 19th century or early 20th century. Now, at that time, one big movement that has taken place is behaviorist evolution. That is, since they didn't know much about what's happening inside the brain, that people would just speculate based on their own individual subjective experiences. And so, whereas any introduction of subjective elements is not okay in science, it's not acceptable in science. Science is all about objective approach, right? You have objective measurements, observables, and based on that, you express them in numerical terms and create a theory and explanation and so on. So that is how the objective science works. Let us characterize behavior and let us express our theories completely in terms of what we see from outside, just behavior. Okay, so this has led to a whole philosophy called behaviorism, and so that kind of dominated the scene in the first half of the 20th century. In the second half, in the middle of 20th century, it saw the rise of the computer, right? Because in the 40s is the time when the first major computers were beginning to be used during World War and all that. And so therefore that was beginning of the rise of the computer. So then the computer metaphor has become quite popular when people try to understand mind. People thought mind is like a big computer, brain is like a big computer. We also saw that in other classes, right? So with this, so that is called the cognitivist revolution, right? The idea that mind is like a computer, so where just like in a computer or an algorithm, you take some data and then you apply first step on that, process those numbers and present it to the second step and then process those numbers again. So the numbers go through a series of modules and they get processed in a sequence, right? So in an algorithm. So people said in cognition also same thing happens, right? You get input from the sensory stimuli, so sensory channels, your eyes and all that, and So first a part of the brain processes them and passes them on to the next part of the brain, and so on and so forth. So that is cognition. So people try to come up with similar explanations even for emotions. So the thing is, it seemed to give some nice explanation to emotions, but one of the fundamental property of emotion, which is they're basically elusive. Why is it so hard to understand somebody's emotions? Forget about somebody. Very often it is hard to understand our own emotions. Why you're feeling what you're feeling. And I'm sure on many days you feel simply out of sorts and you're simply upset about something. You don't even know what it is. You're in a bad mood. That whole day will pass on in a very dull fashion, and you'll have no interest in anything. It's quite possible, right? I mean, so you can't even understand your own emotions. I mean, that's the very nature of emotions. They're elusive, they're mysterious, unpredictable. Therefore, it is even harder to find out what somebody else's emotions. And if you just try to explain emotions like an algorithm, step 1, step 2, and all that, it's absurd because you are robbing emotions of their very fundamental nature, which is elusive. And to understand this aspect of emotions, you have to recognize that emotions are basically unconscious. Their roots are in the unconscious part of the mind. Okay, so that led to other kinds of work about emotions, which talks about the unconscious aspect of emotion. So let us stop here, and because it's a pretty long topic, and I want to go slow. So, any questions on this so far? Hello. So if there are no questions, we can wind up. And so next Wednesday it's the exam, right? So I think your portion and all is clear. It will be the organization of nervous system and the brain maps. Okay, and we'll also send you an article to read the previous day, and the questions will come from both those slides and this article. Okay, if there are no more questions, I'll sign off.
So next Wednesday we have a holiday leave of Ambedkar Jayanti.
Yeah, that's fine, right? You are free. We don't have many classes left, right? Because we are finishing by end of the month. So again, we have one more course, one more quiz, quiz 4. So we don't have much time, so we need to find some time. Okay, thank you.